You good?
Yeah.
So, for those of you who didn't meet me yesterday, my name's Mark Bayley, and I am a rehab doctor. We call ourselves physiatrists in Canada, and you can tell that I'm not from Australia because of my Canadian accent. I'm pleased to be joined by Mia Formichella and Emily Moore, who are going to work with us. And today's session is on concussion, and we will be using a little bit of audience polling, not so much as yesterday, but hopefully you've got your cell phones at the ready, and we'll see if it works. So, without further ado, what we were really hoping to do over the next hour is really discuss what happens during a concussion and some of the challenges in diagnosis, some of the changes in the criteria. We are going to share some of the gaps in concussion care and the experiences that we have. We're going to describe some of the individual and differences in recovery, and we'll have hopefully a few minutes to do a little bit of discussion about how we can work together to improve care. So, this is the Concussion 101. I feel like I am the guy bringing all the information to people who, as Eve said this morning, who know a lot about this. But just a reminder that concussion starts with the movement of the brain within the skull, which initiates a number of things. And if my friend Sam can click on the bottom of that, there you go. And so just a reminder that that results in the changes that we see. And we heard this morning already about the stretching and straining of the axons and nerves being contused or bruised, which results in a cascade of different things. And I don't expect you to read this really easily, but I will emphasize that the axons, when they're shaken at a microscopic level, they will have potentially some injuries to their membranes, which results in influx of electrolytes like calcium that are not supposed to be there. You'll have a stimulation of a number of neurotransmitters, some of which are like glutamate, which is excitatory or it excites nerves. And at the same time, that results in some of the misbalance of the electrolytes within and outside of the cell. And it also may result in changes in the use of sugar by the cell, which may increase the sugar of the use at a time when the blood flow to the brain is not absolutely great. And so all of these different changes are really, and again, I didn't go to everything, trying to keep it relatively straightforward, but some of these changes may be temporary and some of them may be longer term. And that's why concussion is very controversial, because these changes might resolve over the period of 48 hours or a week. And so we are trying to figure out how to measure this. And this is the idea behind developing biomarkers, the idea behind developing imaging techniques. And one of the things that we've been very interested in Toronto is in changes in the blood flow regulation. And this is work that's been published by others like David Hovda and others, where the regulation of the brain may be the problem. So what we did is we took people who were within a few days of their concussion, and we put them in an MRI machine to look at how their blood flow was. Now, not to go into too much detail, but if you inhale carbon dioxide, it makes all your blood vessels in your brain open up. It's a vasodilator. And what we found was that in concussed folks, they had a much larger vasodilation than in normals. So we think that not only is the nerves being injured, but also the regulation of the blood flow to the brain may be a problem. And this may be why exercise helps, because exercise might help to normalize some of this change in the brain regulation of blood flow. So what about concussion? What do we know? Well, this is a quick overview. I will just argue that you folks, I think you had 180,000. We published a paper from Ontario where we looked at everybody in Ontario, and we estimated that 1.2% of the population has a concussion every year. So that means that in Australia, that would be 290,000 people if you extrapolated from the Ontario data. So it's almost 300,000 people in a year will have it. And the problem is that there still is no gold standard tests, that there's no accurate way to predict recovery, although we have some insights. And as you probably heard from Eve and others, most of the research is in athletes and not in the general population. And we know that a certain proportion, 1 of every 5, will not get better. So we're very lucky in Ontario because we have a publicly funded healthcare system, and as I mentioned yesterday, we can track everybody by their unique health card. So we know who came into an emergency room, we know who came into a family doctor. And one of the things that I want to emphasize from this slide, which is important for us to remember when we're all thinking about sports, is this. 65 and 75 to 79-year-olds and 80-year-olds are having some of the highest incidence of concussion. Similarly, we saw in ours that the younger people also have them, but it's a bimodal curve, and we're missing this. And you heard, if you were in the aging session earlier this morning, you would have heard that falls is actually the leading cause, not sports. So we really need to be aware of this. And also, we've also found, we looked at the rurality of where people lived. We also found that people who lived in rural environments were more likely to have a concussion than people who lived in urban environments. So how do we diagnose it? Well, I've given you the QR code, and I'm just going to give you a very brief discussion of the new criteria that were just published for the American Congress of Rehab Medicine. Basically, a group of experts, which includes some of the people in the room, got together and said, well, we should be doing better than we were in terms of diagnosing concussion because it's controversial. And so what we did, what we've emphasized is that signs like disordered thinking and balance difficulties are weighted more differently and more strongly than a symptom, which is like I have a headache. And so we've emphasized these things, and we've also incorporated some of the oculomotor testing and other things that may be abnormal. And similarly, we've put a placeholder for what might be the role of blood-based biomarkers or laboratory tests, and we've included forces as an important part of diagnosing concussion. So if you are looking at the criteria, you'll recognize that the first thing is that a mild traumatic brain injury is diagnosed when following a biomechanically plausible mechanism. That means there has to be exposure of the body to a force, that one or more of the things happen. And so you can have one or more clinical signs, and that's one criteria for making it. You can have acute symptoms, and then if you have a finding like a clinical or laboratory finding, or you can have neuroimaging evidence. And so we emphasize that if you observe somebody at the side of the field or that they have alteration of mental status, that this is one important sign to observe, okay? So let's just go through the steps, just how it works quickly. So step one is, did the injury event result have a plausible mechanism? So that's at the top of the criteria. Then you're asking yourselves, what did you see right after the concussion? What are the acute signs? And were there anything that could have confounded this, like alcohol intoxication, other things that could fully account for their symptoms? So this is just a quick run through. You have the first route you could get to a diagnosis of mild TBI, which is you've observed the person has clinical signs and they have loss of memory or altered mental status. And if you observe those signs will result in you, and they have no other reason for it, then they are considered to have it. So what about if you're asking a person after the event? Well, there might be a way of asking them, like Eve told us this morning, do you remember the impact? Or do you remember the moments before? Were you confused? Were you able to think clearly about what to do after the injury? These are all signs that the person had disordered mental thinking. And similarly, people might have asked them, did you behave out of character in the moments after the injury? Did you cry or become aggressive? These are signs that the brain was injured. The second criteria is really you have two symptoms like a headache, dizziness, and somebody observed you having, like at the sidelines, having impairment on one of the tests, like the modified BESS, which is a balance test, or on the vestibular ocular motor screen. And then a third one is if you had obvious CT or MRI evidence of a brain injury. And then we left it open that sometimes we just can't tell. So if a person has lots of symptoms that go along with a concussion, we can still call them having a suspected mild TBI. And essentially, you're saying, I think this is a mild TBI, but there's subtlety in that, and I'm missing the symptoms. So I could have spent the whole 45 minutes doing that, but I'm not going. But I just encourage you to go to those criteria because I think they really try to help and organize the latest evidence in the best way it can. And so with that little concussion 101, we thought that in this session it'd be super important to hear from people who've lived with concussion. And so Mia's going to talk first, and then Emily, and they're going to share their experiences. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mia Formichella. I'm 31 years old. I'm a lawyer, a writer, and for one short-lived season in 2020, a former football player. As a result of a dangerous tackle in a football game 4 years ago, I have been in recovery after being diagnosed with bleeding on my brain and a concussion. To this day, I am living with post-concussion syndrome. At the start of 2020, I joined a football club and began my first season playing Aussie rules football. At the time, I was a tragic football fanatic, but I'd never had the chance to play myself. When I joined the football team, I was excited about all of the things I was going to gain. A new group of friends, a reason to leave work on time, a fixed calendar of games and social events, fitness, confidence, a welcoming community, a newfound purpose in my days. When I joined the football team, I had never once given thought to all of the things that I would lose. My health, my memory, my ability to work, to drive, to go into a supermarket, to eat in a restaurant, to watch a football game without having a panic attack. As a result of one dangerous tackle, I've missed out on birthdays, engagement parties, christenings, weddings, overseas holidays, and countless opportunities to dance with my friends. I lost close friends I once thought would stay forever, and I lost the last 3 years of my 20s. There are not enough words in the world or time in this presentation to adequately convey just how significantly my life has been and will forever be impacted as a result of one concussion from a football game, but I will try. My last ever game playing footy was in the quarterfinals. It was, ironically, the first and only game that my parents had come to watch. In the second quarter of the game, I was running into the forward 50 with the ball in my hands when an opposition player grabbed my arms and bound them to my side and drove my head and my body into the ground. I lay face down on the oval for what felt like hours but could have only been minutes. I could feel a stinging sensation on my shoulder where I was bleeding from the impact of the fall. I remember wriggling my toes and my fingers but being too scared to move my body. I remember hearing my teammates screaming my name on the sidelines, telling me to come off the field, but no one coming to me. I remember the umpire blowing the whistle and the woman who had thrown my head into the ground being rewarded with a free kick. I didn't lose consciousness, although perhaps if I had done, my doctors would have listened. Eventually, I did make my way off the oval on my own. My bones were in fact all in place, but the feeling in my head and the pain that came about in that moment is one that has never left me. My parents immediately took me to a doctor who did a SCAT-5, in which I scored severely on almost every single measure. Noise sensitivity, light sensitivity, headache, nausea, dizziness, irritability, fatigue, confusion, to name a few. The doctor sent us to the hospital immediately. That afternoon, my parents and I sat in the emergency room at the hospital for nearly 4 hours before being seen. My symptoms were continuing to develop over time, and I was convinced something in me had broken. I was eventually seen by a doctor and sent home with a traumatic brain injury information sheet and medication for the nausea. I was told emphatically that a brain scan wasn't necessary. The following weeks and months were indescribably painful. I went back to the doctor 6 more times, still presenting with symptoms, who told me I wasn't recovering, most likely because I was a female and because of the size of my body. On one occasion, I'd been unable to sleep the night before after experiencing pins and needles for a significant period of time. Despite this, I was never once referred for a scan of my brain and was told the pins and needles were simply from anxiety. My team ended up losing that football game, and the woman who tackled me went on to win the grand final. Months later, I eventually saw people from the football club who said things like, "That was the worst tackle I've ever seen, and that was the worst concussion I've ever seen." yet not one single person from the club contacted my parents, my emergency contacts, to check in. I got the overwhelming impression that my teammates thought this injury was something that could only happen to me but could never happen to them. I was completely and utterly alone in my recovery. I had known other players to have had concussions during the season. I knew of a player who wasn't cleared to play due to the concussion protocol, so to circumvent the rules, she was the runner during the game. During my season, I didn't learn a thing about concussions. I was never told what the protocols were. After my injury, it was me who reached out to my coach and to the trainer because they didn't reach out to me. I honestly don't know if I would have chosen to play if I'd known the risks associated, but I wish I'd had the tools and the resources to arm myself with. I wish someone had been able to give me a clear and definitive map to recovery. I wish someone had told me a concussion can last for more than 2 weeks, or in my case, 4 years. 8 months after my injury, I went to see a new doctor. I was still living with symptoms. I was vomiting every day. I was experiencing memory loss, and the noise sensitivity had become so debilitating, I was rarely leaving the house. This doctor instantly referred me for an MRI. 2 days later, I had the scan, my first one, and 2 days after that, it was revealed that I had a bleed on my left temporal lobe. I had spent 8 grueling months trying to advocate for myself, trying to recover, and I had been repeatedly dismissed. And there was the bleed, and they had sent me home, but I had survived it. I am so grateful to this doctor who listened and who took the time, who expressed to me the importance of looking beyond the patient. I know I have a stoic disposition, and for some doctors, this is all they had seen when they looked at me. I was then referred to a neurosurgeon who then referred me for neuropsych testing, which was able to validate the cognitive defects and memory loss I was experiencing. My entire life after this point became about treatment, and I somehow had to fit this into my work schedule. Being a lawyer used to be the most important thing to me in the world. I am self-aware enough to know how insufferable that is, but I was young and enthusiastic and able-bodied, and only now do I realise just how precarious and unbelievably unimportant it really is. The only thing that was more difficult for me than having a brain injury was doing my job with a brain injury. 2 years ago, the level of fatigue that I was experiencing were at the levels required to be diagnosed with chronic fatigue. Yet I went to work because I couldn't afford not to, because I was bleeding money, because that first doctor had told me I should have recovered after 2 weeks, and because I didn't have an explanation as to why I hadn't. As time went on, I didn't get any better. In fact, I got much worse. Since the day of the injury, I hadn't given myself a genuine chance to recover. So after the diagnosis of the bleed, I reduced my work days from 5 to 4 to eventually 3, and none of it helped. I was in as much pain as I had ever been. After 2 years, I genuinely felt like I was out of options. I would wake up every single morning in the kind of pain I once thought would kill me, believing so deeply that I had ruined my life. And then my neurosurgeon referred me to Birch, the rehab program at Hampstead. There I was given a multidisciplinary team of specialists, a physio, psychologist, exercise physiologist, speech pathologist, occupational therapist, vocational therapist, and social worker who became my entire support system. When I got into rehab, I left my job with no idea if I would ever be able to return to the legal industry or whether I would ever be able to work full-time again. When I first got into rehab, I told my key therapist I didn't want to repeat the story of my injury to each of my therapists. At this point, I'd already encountered treatment from half a dozen specialists, and the difficulty I felt at having to recount the injury had become unbearable. Even today, I quickly brush over the details and likely come across quite unfazed and unfeeling, when the truth is there is rarely a moment in my day when I don't think about that football game. The persistent headache I've had for over 4 years makes sure of that. Thankfully, my therapists at rehab were all supportive and understanding. From that point on, the focus was not on the cause of my injury, but the work that we could do together to finally get my recovery on track. This is a relief to me after having spent much of the last 2 years having to justify the cause of my injury to the people around me. The most common response I received in the early days after my injury, and that I still receive to this day with blame and condescension at its core, was, "Why did you play football?" As if to say, well, what did you expect? I played football because I could. Because despite the internal bias of others regarding women in sport, I wanted to play. It was fun, it gave me something to do, and on a very basic level, I'm pretty good at team sports. And if footy is deemed safe enough for primary school children to play, why is it not safe for me? For the record, I've never once heard that question directed at male footy players, and I know that Buddy Franklin himself would not have walked away from that tackle unscathed. I still have to navigate these conversations, but I've since learned it's not my responsibility to try and alleviate other people's discomfort. And living with a brain injury often makes people uncomfortable. People I've known for years cannot reckon with the fact that my life has changed and that I have changed. Until I got into rehab, I was coordinating my treatment and all of my appointments on my own. Occasionally, I would get conflicting information and advice. It was confusing and it was isolating. And at a time when I felt so desperate, I needed someone to step in and take over. Getting admitted into a 6-month program at Birch was honestly one of the best things that has ever happened to me. I know in the circumstances that's quite dire, but the support and treatment that I received and that my family received was completely life-changing. My therapist helped me to manage my fatigue and my pain and to address my trauma, to finally get back into exercise and to learn how to live my life as a person with a brain injury. And that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the myriad of issues that I was living with. It wasn't straightforward, especially since I had arrived at rehab with the worst mental health that I had ever had. But when I finally lent into the process and trusted the advice, it began to work. My therapist changed my life for the better, and the importance of the work they do could never be overstated. It would be remiss of me not to mention the financial consequences of my injury. I've spent thousands of dollars in treatment over the years. I've lost more of my income than I care to calculate, and I have a HECS debt over $90,000 that's not going anywhere. I only had the lowest income protection insurance provided under my superannuation. So for 2 of the last 4 years, I have received an annual income of $24,000 per year, which is not a livable wage for anyone, especially not someone paying for ongoing medical expenses. I'm cognizant of the fact that my future earning capacity and my career prospects will forever be limited as a result of my injury, but I persevere despite this because I have to. When I agreed to speak at this conference, I made it clear I would not be here to tell a story about how this changed my outlook on life or to tell you that everything happens for a reason. I'm not one for motivational speeches, despite what this may sound like, or inspirational quotes, and I genuinely don't believe every person needs to make lemonade out of their lemons. I can't stand up here and tell you it was just a bump in the road and I'm better off for it, because this has been, without question, the most painful and difficult thing I have ever gone through in my life, and it has caused unjust pain and hardship to my family and to my partner. There is no way to know how different my life would look or how different the past 4 years would have been if I had received the right treatment at the time when I needed it. I often think about how different my recovery could have been. Maybe if I had been properly educated about concussions, if I had known the signs to look out for, or if my club had known how to support me, or if the doctors had not dismissed me. Or maybe if I had been a professional player with money and resources at my disposal, if maybe I had lived somewhere else, or perhaps if my sex or my gender had been different. There is no way to know for certain. This area is a mess of ambiguity, and I am not alone in that. Although what I can say for certain is only when I finally left my job and dedicated over 6 months of my life to intensive rehabilitation did my health actually start to improve. I was on the back foot from the get-go. The misdiagnosis of the bleed, the lack of direction and support. I know now what I would do differently. Right now, I am working 3 days a week, which felt like an impossible feat even 6 months ago when I was only capable of working 10 hours a week. I'm confident and relieved to know I am making progress and continuing to improve, albeit slowly. It's taken 4 years to get here, but I still can't leave the house without my earplugs and my noise-cancelling headphones. I consider myself lucky to have a job and to be in a supportive team, because it took encountering what felt like 101 rejections from employers who would not accommodate someone like me. I'm in a job that I genuinely love and one I would have wanted regardless of this injury, but I am years behind my peers, and I might always be. I hate that we live in a world that favours the able-bodied and that tries to tell me that I'm a burden, because in reality, I can look around a room and know that I'm doing the same thing as everybody else, but with my eyes forced shut and my hands tied behind my back. That's not to say it's right to push through or to carry on through pain, because it's objectively not, and I learned that the hard way. But it's to acknowledge the head start that most people get in life, the one I used to so casually take for granted. Recovery is ongoing, and living with a brain injury will never not be difficult. There might always be things I can't do because of the pain, and some things that might always be too hard. I didn't walk away from rehab with a miracle cure, but I walked away with strategies and a support system, and hope that my best days are still ahead of me. Thank you for listening.
Great job. And we'll welcome up Emily.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily. Gosh, Mia, wow, you made that a hard act to follow. So for a bit of context, I was a radiographer myself. I've had several concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries in my life from a variety of different reasons. A fall when I was little, a car crash, and a couple from playing sport. But for me, the one that was particularly life-changing occurred when I was 24 in 2020. I was playing soccer and I was the goalkeeper. To be honest, I have very sporadic memories of this time and I don't remember a lot, so apologies if it is a bit jumpy. I know from what I can remember and seeing a video that as the goalkeeper, I dove forward to save a goal and the girl decided she still wanted to score, so she swung her leg and her shin hit me clean in the forehead. From the video that I've seen back of the incident, it was nothing like what they show in the media about concussion or when they talk about brain injury. It looked totally innocuous. I don't believe I lost consciousness, but I do remember opening my eyes on the ground and being in incredible pain in my forehead and my neck. And I think I actually walked myself off the pitch. I didn't break any bones. There was not a drop of blood on me, and I didn't even end up with a bruise. But what I do remember is sitting against the change rooms at my soccer club crying uncontrollably because I was meant to be at work. I was meant to be at work 2 hours after the game and I knew that I wasn't going to make it. And as someone who's not an emotional person, that seemed crazy. But obviously, as many of you know in this room, being emotionally volatile is a big indicator of concussion. On that day, I was playing in the first of 2 back-to-back soccer games, and what I do recall is I had my coach lie me down next to the marquee, but the light was too bright in the middle of winter. The sunlight was too bright, the noise was too much, so my team covered me in jackets because they didn't know what to do with me. And I remember trying not to vomit every time I heard the ref blow their whistle. From what I've been told, apparently I told everyone that I was fine and refused all help and wouldn't let them call an ambulance. But they did have one person checking on me, quote unquote, to make sure I was still alive. Obviously, at the time, my team didn't have a concussion action plan. We didn't even know what these were. And this is something I've since implemented at the club after my accident. Eventually, I did have to call my mum to come and get me because I couldn't even stand up. And we went to the local medical centre, which was the only one open on a Sunday afternoon, which is when women's soccer is played. We sat in the waiting room there for hours. When we eventually saw this GP, he didn't look at me, he barely spoke to me, he just heard I had a sore neck and sent me to see the practice nurse. And thankfully that nurse took one look at me and went, "Oh my goodness, I'm calling an ambulance." So it was about 4 to 5 hours after my accident that I eventually ended up in hospital. In the hospital, I don't remember much at all. Obviously, as a radiographer, I do remember a vague conversation about them doing an MRI versus a CT because of the radiation exposure. But from what my mum's told me, my MRI came back completely normal, no pathology at all. I did have an obvious nystagmus, which is the eye jittering, and I couldn't move my head or stand up without vomiting. I was discharged from the hospital and told to go see a concussion doctor in a couple of days if I didn't feel any better. So from there, I had to coordinate going to see my local GP to get sick leave from work because I was a full-time shift worker at the time. He did a couple of the SCAT tests and every week he'd give me a sick certificate for work. And other than going to the GP, I don't remember much at this time. I actually had my birthday in this period and I don't remember it at all. I slept most of the time. I spent about 18 hours a day in bed. I couldn't look at my phone, I couldn't watch TV, I couldn't listen to music, read books, or do anything. I started developing migraines for the first time in my life, and I was getting them more than daily. This whole time, I just thought I would wake up one day and feel completely normal, especially coming from such an AFL family background who just shrug it off, it'll be fine, you'll be all right tomorrow. And obviously this didn't happen, which was extremely confusing. So I just had to keep making an appointment to go see this GP every week. And every week he'd tell me that I'm not ready to go back to work and just give me more sick leave. So anytime I spoke to any professionals, they just told me they couldn't tell me when I'd feel better, but it would be soon. Meanwhile, I'm trying to have to advocate to myself at work why I needed more time off work, tell my friends why I wasn't at soccer anymore, and communicate why I couldn't chat to them on the phone. I do remember a couple of weeks After my accident, I did try and get in touch with the doctor that the hospital recommended, but I got told that he didn't see patients with just a concussion. And after a few months of seeing the GP, he sent me to a neurologist, who in the appointment looked at the MRI, said there was nothing wrong on it, he'd seen worse, and sent me away, charging $900 for the appointment. This time was obviously very hard. I'm a very sporty person, and I was also very musical, but I couldn't go anywhere near these two hobbies because of my symptoms. I had to walk around the house wearing sunglasses all the time. I could barely be outside. I couldn't be around my dog. I couldn't tolerate any noise or music without it developing into migraines. One day, my doctor recommended going for a run to see if that made me feel better, but I almost passed out because my heart rate kept skyrocketing, and then that triggered more migraines. Like I said, I didn't have any broken bones, bleeding, stitches, or even a bruise. So for me, there was nothing visibly wrong with me. And as a radiographer and a healthcare professional, I just couldn't understand what the heck was going on. It felt like it was all imaginary and made up in my head. And the way that I was speaking to people and the feedback I was getting, it felt like I was absolutely the only person in the world going through this experience. And obviously that was really lonely and took a really big toll on my mental health. And I still to this day have this feeling of grief for this life that I used to have. It wasn't until months after my incident that I eventually got to see a neurophysio for the first time. And around this time, I was referred to the public rehab clinic. So I started speaking to them via telehealth because obviously it was a COVID time. And a few months later, I was accepted into the outpatient concussion rehab clinic. Being admitted to this clinic, as Mia said, really changed my recovery for the better. I was able to go a couple of times a week and see multiple people like physios, speech paths, occupational therapists, and just get the rehab help that I needed. They were also very understanding and just helped me come to terms with this experience and realise that I wasn't alone. So returning to work for me was particularly difficult. 5 months after my injury, I started trying to make a return to work because I'd well and truly run out of sick leave and I needed it financially and just for myself. I started off trying to work a 4-hour shift once or twice a week, and it was the most horrible experience of my life. Not returning to work, obviously being there was great, but a hospital environment is full of triggers, and these would leave me bedbound for days after a shift. I wasn't allowed to be in the X-ray department by myself. I struggled with problem solving. I couldn't tolerate any of the noises or alarms that a hospital is full of, but I just had to keep trying. In my job, there's no quiet office task that you can do, so I just had to keep persisting with what it was. In March the following year, my contract being in a shift radiographer ran out and it wasn't extended. So not only was I recovering from a brain injury, but I found myself unemployed. Thankfully, later I was able to return there in a part-time position, but it definitely hasn't been an easy return, managing all these prolonged symptoms in such a high-paced hospital environment. So that's really my story in a nutshell. I've said to many people that I just don't believe in the saying, everything happens for a reason. There would be many people here that know that going through a brain injury is absolutely horrible, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But for me, I have to make the best of a crappy situation. So this experience raised more questions than answers for me and spurred me on into going to research in the space. So now I'm currently studying a PhD in concussion and looking at how the brain communicates. Hopefully one day I'll be able to help contribute to coming up with a diagnostic test for concussion that doesn't rely on that subjective symptom reporting, which many of you know has its flaws. I imagine many people in the room here have been through very similar experiences to Mia and I, or perhaps completely different. And being up here and telling and sharing our stories doesn't make it any better or any more tolerable for us, and it doesn't for you either. But hopefully by sharing our experiences with concussion, we can get more healthcare practitioners to take it seriously, or at least know what to do, ensure that patients get the care they need as soon as possible. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thanks for sharing. And we aren't going to let them completely off the hook because we're going to bring them back in a couple of minutes. So, you've heard their stories, and I'm going to share a little bit of ours, but I wanted to kind of go to a poll because I was curious. As many of you may be aware, there's lots of gaps in care. We heard about them, and I thought it would be good if we all sort of weighed in on what do you think the problem is? What's the biggest problem? We have a lot of work to do, and as many of you know from yesterday, you can scan the code up there. It takes you to the poll, and you can choose one. Unfortunately, I'm not letting you say all of the above. Sam and Tom have got really good at this now. So I think what you heard in both Mia and Emily's discussion is the importance of running into and having a person who actually has training in concussion when you first hit the healthcare system. And that's what I think many of you are saying. And then we also heard from both Mia and Emily the importance of when you are not doing well, that you get access to a specialized clinic. But there's also a good number of you who recognize that concussions are being missed on the field. We heard about the intimate partner violence. We heard about all these other places in which concussions are being missed. So we've done some work on this, and so the next thing I wanted to do over the next few minutes was just describe some of the gaps in concussion care that people experience, and we've heard already. And so we've been doing a project called Pathways, which I alluded to yesterday, and not only have we done pathways for the more severe brain injury, but also for concussion. You can go to the website and navigate. I won't ask you to do it right away. But basically what we've identified is, in addition to identifying the key practices that we think people should see, many of which you heard about, whether they be the acute care, recognizing the concussion and diagnosing it, and the rehab, getting the rehab in the community. And what we did was we created these pathways that are specific to concussion, and in addition, we created companion quality indicators that match with what people said were priorities. And if you see the little blocks A, B, C, D, those are the barriers or problems where there were gaps. And so this is what when we interviewed people, hundreds of people, they also agreed that lack of training and education about symptom recognition was a problem. So for non-medical professionals, that there was poor availability of outpatient specialized rehab and multidisciplinary care. There was, in particular when people had mental health and headaches and other things, there was poor interprofessional models. And then for us, we have people who don't get access to third-party rehab because they don't have funding like insurance. And so these are really challenges. And so we did a follow-up. We'd followed everybody who had had a concussion in Ontario, and we said, okay, when did they get to see their doctor? So I'll just highlight some of the findings. The first is that only 40% of the people saw somebody within the first couple of weeks. And even when we go out to, so that's 40, so only 40% of people got follow-up from emergency room within 30 days. So that's 60% of people not seeing any family doctor or specialist of any kind. And similarly, when you go out to 365 days, there were still 25% of people who had not seen a doctor following their concussion. So this is not good and probably reflects on some of the challenges we all face. And then if you follow people, okay, so what happens to this group? We found that the people who'd had a concussion, we followed how many times they were going to see a mental health professional. And you can see that compared to the general population of Ontario, in the first couple of years, and it was well above the use. And we found that people who'd had a mild TBI were 2 times as likely to show up in emergency care again, and 2 times as likely to see a mental health professional. And if they'd had a brain injury with bruising or a complicated mild brain injury like Mia did, they were 3.5 times as likely to come back to care and require mental health. So this is clearly a problem that we're all seeing that is not being followed up. And I'll just say that if, again, just highlighting that this isn't just about young people, it's also about older people. And we are able to look at where people live. So if you're 80 or over, we can see that you're coming back to the emergency room. If you had pre-existing cognitive difficulties, you're coming back frequently. And also, I'll just highlight that we're able to look at where people live in Ontario and assign an average income for their postal code. And you can see that in addition to the fact that people who have concussion, the group that had the lowest income or lived in a region of lowest income were much more likely to also use healthcare. So I think the key takeaways from all of what you may have heard over the last few minutes is that concussion is common and it requires ongoing care and support beyond the acute care. And once discharged, people are not getting the coordination they need. And we also need to focus on the elderly. And that means that people also need access to mental health supports. I will briefly just say that we did develop a concussion calculator, which I'll show you at the end. But basically, we looked at the healthcare data and we looked at who was going to see a specialist more than 2 years after more than 6 months after their concussion. And it allows us to look in our Ontario and predict who will be coming back into care. So now I wanted to briefly move on to when concussion becomes chronic, and a little bit, we do not have time today to talk about treatment. We could spend the whole conference talking about treatment. But I just wanted to say that I find this model is helpful for explaining to folks how we think about concussion. The injury causes both physical symptoms and cognitive symptoms, and you can start wherever you want on this cycle. And if you have a lot of physical symptoms, like your headache, dizziness, visual symptoms, it's really hard to pay attention, and it's really hard to focus. And if you can't focus, then you can't remember that well. If you're disturbed by anxiety or other things, it's going to make your cognitive symptoms worse. What does the cognitive symptoms? You feel overwhelmed, you get more tense, and it makes your mood worse. And so I often explain to people that you are in the vicious cycle. And the way we've approached this in our guidelines is we've broken it down because we realized that you can either be a lumper or a splitter, and we decided we'd be splitters. And so basically, if you go to the Living Concussion Guidelines that were created by the Ontario Neurotrauma and now my colleague Sean Marshall, who leads it, what we've done is we've broken it down by symptoms. And so that if you have fatigue, here's how to manage it. If you have a headache, here's how to manage it. If you have cognitive or mental health. And these were designed for family doctors. And I know that you folks have done, I know that Jenny Pomsper was telling me that you've got your own guidelines that are just about, we just need to get it to the family doctors. The family doctors are not using these. And we did a study, Noah Silverberg and some of us did a study where when the person came to the specialized concussion clinic, they would give them a handout which was taken from the guidelines and sent it to their family doctor. And we found that those who got a handout from us were more likely to get guideline adherent care from the family doctor. So we can do better. So with that, I just wanted to briefly stop for a moment to have a little bit of discussion with Emily and Mia and discuss a little bit about what would you, if there was one thing we could do better with your care, I think it'll be live in just a second. What would you like to see? We already sort of asked people. Do you want to go first, Mia?
For me, I think the biggest failing, but also opportunity, would be for the general practitioners to have a greater grasp on diagnosis. I know for me it was really difficult to get my GP to take me seriously, the one who didn't order an MRI, and that, for instance, I had the GP do a test of my eyes with a light like this and said, there's no way you could have a bleed on your brain because you've passed that test, and we know I did have a bleed on my brain. So I think from a very early stage, having someone to tell you where to go and to be able to recognise the signs, I just don't know if we have that across the board. And I don't think being in a small state
should really dictate the quality of care that we get, although that seems to be an issue.
Thanks.
Mine kind of stems almost back to the community level. So one thing that I'm very passionate about is making people more aware of what a concussion is, recognising signs and symptoms, implementing the concussion action plans, but then also being able to say to someone like Mia in her example, say, here are some people that you can see. I recommend you go and talk to people in this area rather than people, like for example, my GP looked up a neurologist who was apparently a concussion specialist, but he had to find that through Google. It wasn't a concussion mild traumatic brain injury registry, so there was no guarantee. He'd just literally written it on his website.
Thanks very much. That's great. So I think hopefully this is resonating in some of the challenges we have, and I'm going to keep moving because I really wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time about what we've been doing to try and make it a little bit better, and I will go through this pretty quickly, but I would, and at the end I will have a way you can get to the resources and the outcomes. But what we did is we created the Hull Ellis Concussion and Research Clinic. The idea behind this was that we would create a rapid access clinic that people would be seen within a week, and we would follow patients. We would collect data on lots of different things about concussion, and we develop pathways and particularly make sure that everybody got the latest care and any innovations that we have. And they're seen by family doctors. They're seen at week 1, they're seen week at 2. They're seen by, our specialized doctors. They're seen at week 1, they're seen at week 2. They're seen at weeks 4, 6, and 8 if they still have symptoms. And this has allowed us to follow the general population. We've had over almost 3,000 people, and about 1,100 have been involved. So here are some of the, I could spend the whole hour speaking about some of our findings, but I'll just tell you some of the things that I think we should highlight for everybody in the room. One is that only 18% of the cohort from the general population was recovered by week 3. The sports literature says you should be recovered by week 2. That's just not, in the general population, it's not the case. And the rest of the group recovered, 56% of the cohort recovered between weeks 4 and 8. So our whole idea of recovery in the general population should be altered. And fully 25% of our group at 8 weeks was not recovered. So we are being overly generous, and we need to make sure that our prognosis is appropriate. And here's the thing we're going to talk a little bit further about is we notice, as other studies have noticed, that twice as many women were not recovered at the 8-week point as men. So this is what's been published, but I think it really is important for us. So in following lots of people, we studied people's sleep. We followed we followed people and look at whether they were, they were having headache. And so some of the things that we gained insights on is that the people who are going to recover are usually the people who are men who are less than 60 years old and haven't got a migraine, because if you have a migraine, that makes things worse. And if you have fewer symptoms. This has been found in lots of studies that the burden of symptoms is the best prognostic indicator. Some surprising things we found is we studied people who used cannabis. Surprisingly, cannabis actually did not associate it with a slower recovery. We also studied sense of smell. Why would we study sense of smell? Well, because your sense of smell, your olfactory nerve, which it goes through the skull here, is very vulnerable if your brain gets shaken. So we tried to do that, and we didn't find an association. We think it may be that the concussion was not significant enough in our group. However, this has been reported in the literature to be prognostic. Similarly, when we looked at symptoms recovering, we found that migraine, if you have a history of migraines or you have headaches, all of your symptoms are worse. So headaches are a major, you heard it from Mia and Emily, they're a major problem that we really need to treat. But we did find that if it was treated properly, that 80 to 90% would be back to their baseline frequency of headaches. So people who were migraineurs before returned to their previous level of migraine. But certainly 20% were not. We found that people who had pre-existing mental health issues were more likely to be symptomatic, and we weren't able to find some conclusive cognitive findings that were always present. So this is, obviously we have a platform. We have all these people running in from the emergency rooms, 6 emergency rooms. So that's allowed us to do a lot of the research, and I'll just share you the link so you can see it. We're studying eyes, we're studying psychological profiling to look at which groups might need to have more advanced care earlier. We've been involved, as many of you have heard today, about exercise and looking at a number of other things in this area. So it may not be lost on you. I know that those of you attended, all of you probably attended the morning plenary with Eve, that women are, there's 2 women up here, they both played sports, and a lot of us think of men. And so this is a summary of some of the state-of-the-art that Eve and the group did, and I think I would just encourage you to look at that as why we might be facing this challenge. And I think why we need to pay better attention is basically there's less research into women and concussion. We heard that they're participating in more contact sports. They're most likely to be the victims of intimate partner violence, which is not recognized. Women have a different approach to seeking health care, and so we don't know whether or not that's maybe a fact. And then we don't understand all the differences in physiology, anatomy, and endocrinology. So these are all things that we think we need to do a lot more work on. And indeed, it just so happens that today in Canada is Rowan's Day. And Rowan Stringer was a rugby player in Ottawa, Ontario, who died in 2013. And what happened was that she was playing in, I believe, if I get it right, she was playing in a sports league in rugby, and she also was playing rugby in school. And what happened was she had 1 concussion, and nobody told anybody else about her concussion, and she returned to play in another game within a week or 2 and suffered a very rare but fatal condition called second impact syndrome and died. And so that led to legislation which now in Ontario mandates that all clubs and all concussion people get cleared to return to play by a physician or specialist, and they also have to have protocols in place in the schools and protocols in place in the hockey teams so that we won't have people playing in one sport and then going over to another and playing in concussion. So it just so happens that today's is Rowan's Day, but I thought we might just flag that as something that we'll come back to it. I'm just looking at my time. We have a few minutes left, right, Nick? So I thought we would do another little bit of thinking about this, and we'll come back to Mia and Emily for a moment. First of all, where should we focus our education about concussion? So we've heard a lot about it. We got a lot of work to do. You heard about the gaps in care, the elderly, women. Where do you think we need to focus? If we haven't got all the time in the world, and so I'm going to launch this. Sorry, I got to remember to do. This is the multitasking, and I'm not always. It should go live now. So, everybody got it? So, who we have are coaches, sports, referees, teachers. You know, the family doctors, the general public, policymakers, and the government, and we also education of employers. You get to see it before they do. You guys are fast now. So as you can see, it looks like family doctors are our target audience. So that was who we targeted with our guidelines, and certainly I know you've got your own, and I think we probably do need to find a way to do that. I know that we are, in Ontario, we have a program called ECHO, which is where family doctors can attend video conference with experts in concussion, and we do case-based, they bring their own cases to the scenario, and we have experts who actually explain to them what they would do, and it's been well used. It's a education strategy that was brought in from the U.S. And is used for many, many different specialized difficulties like hepatitis and rheumatology and other things. But we found that it's been good attendance in that. We also have guidelines and things like this. So with that, I'm just going to go on to the next slide, which is the next poll, which is basically, I'm going to stop this one, and we're just going to hear from you. What would you like to see us do to improve stroke care? What changes would you like to see? And this is a word cloud, so we'll do a little bit of that, and then we're going to have a little bit of Q&A in the minimal time we have left. Are they coming? Can't hear what he said. Yes. Question. Blake's going to help.
Sorry. I would just like to firstly say that you just have reiterated everything that we know in Western Australia is a problem. But I'm interested in how you funded the concussion clinic you set up.
So our concussion clinic?
Yep.
So our concussion clinic, truth be told, it was set up through philanthropy and research grants. So we were very generous. Ice hockey fans, Dennis Hull and Ron Ellis are former very prominent hockey players who are on Team Canada that played Russia. And they were sponsors, and we had a big gala. It raised some money, and they've been big sponsors for us. And we've been continuing to benefit from that. Helps pay for the infrastructure. But the doctors get paid by the health authority, and so like a lot of the things we do, other than the sort of data and research, is covered by the government. So we were able, that's how we did it.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a good sign. Nick actually gave me a couple of minutes extra. I'm teasing. Anyway, I wanted to highlight some of the things that are in the word cloud. Clearly, education and funding for this is coming up a lot. Early intervention, specialized service, and I even see some people talking about stop medical gaslighting. So yes, we need to educate people about the controversy of concussion and the importance of relatable info. So I think we have a lot of work to do. I would like to open it up for questions. And before I do, I wanted to just say to make sure that Mia, if you have any questions for Mia and Emily, because we didn't really stop and have questions for them. So we'll open it up for everybody for a few minutes, if that's okay.
I have a question for Mia, I think. I had a severe traumatic brain injury, and the bleeding in my brain was so bad that they had to take out a piece of my skull. What did they do for you when they found out that you had a brain bleed? Was it just rest? Was it just take some medicine, seizure medicine? What did they actually do to care for you?
Is this on? Okay.
Yeah, it's on.
It was 8 months after the actual injury. So at that point, we were just waiting for the bleed to reabsorb, which was, you feel a bit useless. There's nothing really to be done at that point. But if they'd caught it at the start, I would have been kept in the hospital for observation to watch a stroke. But thankfully, never came to pass anyway. So no negative consequences, as in I didn't die. But I think not having early intervention meant that symptoms that I had that were related to the bleed, I wasn't able to address because I couldn't fix the memory loss, because I thought that was based on the concussion, but it was mostly the bleed. So once the bleed reabsorbed after, I think 6 months after I'd had the scan, my memory was starting to improve at that point. So from there, you never really know what the cause of anything is, but we were able to kind of put things together and say this must have been the reason. But yeah, thankfully, no need for surgery, just watch and see.
We have a question
Hi.
over here. Thanks.
This question's for both Emily and Mia. I'd like to know what you found most helpful in rehab.
So what did you find helpful in rehab?
As in, like, who or just what part of rehab? Wow. That's a huge question. For me, one of the biggest things was being validated and having someone go, yep, that's understandable, rather than being, oh, yeah, it'll be fine, you'll get over it. So much of it, it was really multidisciplinary. I know it's hard to pinpoint one thing. Like, I've had a few concussions, and every time something different was better for it.
I had a lot of different issues. So at Birch, I had treatment for a whole range of things, but I think the biggest issue that I was dealing with was hyperacusis, so extreme sensitivity to noise, and my speech pathologist is in the room, Liz. She helped me address that. So I did some sound therapy, which was, it's not resolved, but it was very useful, and fatigue management was a really big thing in learning how to space out my days and start my days with a certain number of spoons and then use them as I go. And also Tanya Straga, I don't know if she's here, but I had some issues with my eyes I didn't know about until I think nearly 3 years after my injury. And once I saw an orthoptist, I realised that there were things that I could have done from day one that helped with my headache significantly. So that's an area people didn't talk about that was really beneficial.
Thanks. I think we've got lots of questions, but not lots of time. So just wanted to say thanks to, I think we recognize there's a lot of gaps in care, and I want to thank the team at Hull Ellis. And for those of you who wondered about the resources, you can scan that at Eileen got me a new QR code after yesterday's talk and sent it to me. So if you want, what it takes you to is the best practice resources, the Hull Ellis stuff, the other things. But it's not really, I think the most important part of this discussion was really what we heard from Mia and Emily. I know that Mia told me just before we started that this was the first time that she presented like this, and I thought she did an amazing job, so I'd just like to thank them both. So I think it's time to move on to our other section. This is, and there's some great follow-up discussions. I know some of you are interested in what happens in the long term and other things, and so concussion is the theme for some of the afternoon.
So hello everyone, and welcome to this penultimate session of the day, I think. Fantastic. So this is also about concussion, or so-called mild traumatic brain injury. I think a number of us have probably had experiences of same. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Turn off your phone, please. Take care of yourselves. It's sometimes unexpected what you find confronting. If you do find anything a bit confronting, feel free to walk quietly out of the room and gather your thoughts as you wish. Afternoon tea is at 4. We'll try and finish on time for that. We'll see how we go because we're 10 minutes late starting. We have 3 different speakers, and I'm just going to introduce them in turn. So our first speaker is Les Koopowitz, is that right? Koopowitz, who is going to speak about there's nothing mild about mild traumatic brain injury. Les is from the University of Adelaide here in South Australia.
I presume I just press this green button and yes. So basically, hello everybody. My name's Les, and it's thanks to Keita and Keita's mother that I'm here, because they told me about this conference and suggested that I say something. I've been practicing in this field, in the field of neuropsychiatry, for well, since 1991, you can work out the dates. And if there's one thing I've learned about mild traumatic brain injury, it's anything but mild, the damage that it does to people. But it provokes a lot of controversy. And the major reason it provokes controversy is all of us crave certainty, and that's why we create categories. That's why we sort of categorize and look at classification systems. And the problem about doctors and medical school and most health professionals is we're taught by pattern recognition. So we're taught to take a history, get the pattern of the symptoms and signs, and then test what we have clinically uncovered by the evidence of observation. So when we see somebody with the plethora of symptoms that can happen with a mild brain injury, it confuses the hell out of us doctors. And it goes against virtually everything that we were trained to do at medical school. And it makes us have to think in different ways. So if we had to stick to that, just look for specific criteria, which a lot of people still do, unfortunately, it actually is not only unhelpful, but as we've heard from previous speakers, actually can be also harmful. So there's much more to understanding in mild TBI than the actual brain injury itself, because it's also, the way I put it, dependent on the brain that was injured, as opposed to the brain injury specifically. So again, people learn, these are the symptoms of acute appendicitis, these are the symptoms of pneumonia, these are, when it comes to brain injury, those symptoms aren't so straightforward because you're bringing it with a person who has a whole history of how they've dealt with their lives before them. It is very important understanding the neurobiological cascade, which is, again, is another thing that's poorly taught in medical schools. Neuroscience is still very heavily neglected in medical schools. And then the other big problem is someone's got to pay for all of this, and personalized and precision medicine is costly and time-consuming. It's far easier to categorize than look at each person as an individual. And the biggest problem related to this whole field is litigation. And because usually, and certainly in South Australia, if there's an accident involved, then you can bet your bottom dollar there's going to be litigation. And the problem with litigation is those of us working in the field of brain injury, we know that we focus, and we try to focus on what that recovering brain can do. When somebody actually has to pay for it, the whole focus is on proving what is wrong with me. What can that brain not do? And if litigation is a factor, then we've got the obscurity and the obfuscation of them saying, well, it's not the injury, the person, and we've seen it from slides from earlier this morning and before, mental health is the problem. And that is, well, I'll come to that, but that is such a spurious or false argument. And so we get people who are then labeled as somatizers and have functional neurological disorders. And the problem is that, again, if you look at all the statistics, females are the ones who are targeted more as that, going back to the old concept of hysteria, which the other problem is that it's not a straightforward condition. So there's lots of different pathological and pathophysiological processes going from biochemical changes to blood flow changes to actual physical disruption of neurons. And more than one pathological process can be initiated by a single event. And so this is the problem, that sort of search for the holy grail of one specific diagnostic test that's never going to eventuate. The other problem is that people say, well, you're traumatized. And you get the question, especially from the insurance companies, well, how much is the TBI and how much is the trauma related to it? So mild TBI actually enhances the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder because neural damage sustained in the injury compromises the critical neural circuitry required to regulate fear following the traumatic experience. So how our brain makes sense of something stressful that happens to us, it tries to connect and it tries to put it in context. If the very injury that causes that disrupts that connectivity, then what you're going to get is you're going to get people focused and immersed in their emotions as opposed to being able to think through it. And my definition of trauma is stress that our brain cannot make sense of. So, that then begs the question, that whole furphy that we have to deal with in clinical practice, and especially where litigation is involved, that whole question of, it's psychological versus physiological. And unfortunately, all I can say about my medical colleagues in all these years is as soon as they can't understand or give an explanatory model, they say, refer to psych, and psych is a very indiscriminate term. So, but I mean, again, there's a lot of research which shows that there's a huge overlap, and my question then is, why can't it be both? Why do you have to divide? Because when people say they're telling me it's all in my head, I say, yes, it is all in your head, because your brain's in your head. And everything that's happening inside there is happening to you, and your brain is having a hell of a trouble making sense, especially when you're not being validated, especially when you're not being heard. So, and the other problem is, it doesn't only target the brain, because the brain is connected to everything, the brain controls everything. So unless this is understood, that the implications are that a person is going to feel physically unwell in so many different domains, with autonomic, with gastrointestinal, with vestibular-ocular, with whatever problems there are, but the universal figure, and I saw from one of the earlier slides that it's too non-specific a symptom, but to me, this is the major problem, the universal problem that everyone with a brain injury, any type of acquired brain injury, but whether it's traumatic, and if it's traumatic brain injury, the so-called severity of the brain injury doesn't matter. Fatigue and neurofatigue is where it's at. And the understanding of that is that our brain might comprise 2% of body weight, but at its most efficient, the most connected, most efficient brain is using 20% of our body's energy at any one time. And the injured brain, at various stages of the injury, is using sometimes 3-4 times that amount of energy. And so there's not much left over for the body. And fatigue is different from tiredness. It's a sensation of exhaustion, of lack of energy. And the important thing, if you look at the bottom of the slide, is while tiredness is proportional to the effort exerted, fatigue is associated with an exaggerated, disproportionate perception of effort. And that fools doctors again, because people are saying, doesn't matter, I can sleep and I'll still wake up exhausted. And the other thing that we forget, the most energy-intensive task of any brain is to think. Okay? Feeling and doing and responding is far less energy-intensive. To connect our frontal lobes, especially our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, our parietal lobes, uses up far, is the least energy-efficient task any brain can have, which is why we get so exhausted just by focusing, paying concentration, and thinking. So, sorry. So how can we help manage people with a mild TBI? It's translating that understanding of basic physiology, basic energy utilization into the clinical setting. And this is what I wrote in a medical legal report. Really totally fed up with having to justify that these people are rarely injured and therefore need funding. And they're not looking for payouts. They're just looking for somebody to pay their bills and get the necessary care that they can get. So I wrote there, because a traumatic brain injury is an event, clinicians and those responsible for funding the clinicians have created the myth that a traumatic brain injury provokes static damage and that recovery is finite. Any observant and thoughtful clinician working in the field of brain injury recovery will be aware that the actual index injury occurs to a brain that has its own individual history and genetic advantages and challenges. The combination of an insult to that brain and the context in which the accident occurred remain pertinent, and they both contribute to the neurobehavioral and neurocognitive sequelae of any brain injury. From the moment of impact, that injured brain begins its attempts at recovery. That's why there's that confusion and that alertness and that the conscious changes. And what we then tend not to understand, no matter how mild the injury is, it's the beginning of a lifelong adaptive process that needs guidance and care. The degree of support and care will not only be dependent on the injury itself, not to mention any other attendant injuries, but the context of the injury, the makeup and history of the person who was injured, and their supports, and the individualized needs resulting from all of the above. And that's the bottom line, is try to understand the brain that suffered the injury. There's no place for a protocol-driven approach, and each recovery program needs to be tailored to meet the needs of the individual. Because if we can understand as clinicians that we're dealing with the most important organ of our body, an injured brain, which is an exhausted, bewildered, regressed and irritable organ. And regressed is, we see, if we can't think connected consistently to the thinking areas, the cognitive areas of our brain, we rely on instinctive behavior. People see this as regressed behavior. Unfortunately, if you're an adult and you have this regressed behavior, you're seen as being mentally disordered as well, and seeing as then having mental health issues. So part of what I've seen in my practice is so many people being misdiagnosed with depression or anxiety or PTSD or even psychosis, when everything can be explained in terms of the connectivity that was disrupted because of the actual injury itself. So you can't ignore fatigue. It's an integral component of the condition, and it's not a psychological reaction to the stress of living, as I've had arguments in court about this. It's a psychological reaction to the stress of living with an acquired brain injury. It's actually fatigue is just so integral to this. The vast majority of people with a mild traumatic brain injury do not need hospitalization or formal neuro rehab. Most are likely to make a relatively rapid recovery. And again, most effective interventions don't question the actual, did the injury really occur? It's early, validate the person, early support, education, realistic expectation setting, and reassurance about the rate and event of a spontaneous recovery. And our brain, the recovering brain, knows what it's doing. Respect it and allow it to recover at its own pace. So I call it a common sense and pragmatic approach, or real life rehabilitation. my 3 golden rules that focus on one task at a time, do that one task as slowly as possible, and then pace yourself. Listen to your recovering brain. Recognize fatigue before it sets in, because the brain, unlike any other organ, actually doesn't have physical pain receptors. So you can't rely on pain to tell you that you need to take the weight off your brain. So becoming a bit emotional, losing a bit of concentration, long before the actual fatigue sets in. Once the fatigue sets in, it's often too late to do anything about it. So my rational approach, there's no protocol, it's highly individualized. Understand the context of the injury, understand the actual injury itself, understand the brain that was injured, and if required, very cautious and judicious use of medication, but it's definitely not the mainstay of treatment. Thanks very much.
That was totally beautiful and resonated for me, but would anyone like to ask any questions of Les? We've got a few minutes. You'll have to wave your arms a bit because I'm a bit slow seeing people. Yes?
Thank you, Les, for a great presentation. I was wondering what your thoughts were about the introduction of low-dose sort of stimulant medications where fatigue persists and is quite debilitating for patients.
Okay, so again, I haven't gone into pharmacotherapy a lot, but again, that's where the importance of understanding what's happening chemically in that brain. Immediately after a brain injury, the brain releases glutamate. Glutamate tries to make the brain work more. It's excitatory. There's a very fine line between it being excitatory and excitotoxic. So too much glutamate. So in my experience, the timing of the psychostimulants, if we give psychostimulants too early when that brain isn't ready to recover, we'll cause more damage. So we need to work out with each person, when is the time that your brain needs a bit of extra help in connecting to areas that can help you focus a bit better, that can give you a bit more of an energy boost. And in my experience, it's very rarely shorter than about 12 months. But it's different for different people, but it is the timing of when to use medication.
Thank you. Any more questions or reflections? One here.
Hello, my name's Sarah. Not a question, but just a comment. I just wanted to say thank you because you actually wrote a report for my brother back in the early 1990s. He sustained an acquired brain injury. Unfortunately, there wasn't the NDIS back then, but in 2019, the report that you wrote saying that he'd had an acquired brain injury and it wasn't mental health was the key piece of evidence we used to gain access for him to the NDIS. So thank you.
That's actually gratifying to know that one court listened for a change.
Any more? No? Well, thank you again, Les Koopowitz. That was really terrific. I'm sure any of us with a severe concussion would have liked to have come across Les early on in our journey. Now, our next speaker is Tristan Clements, who is going to speak to us about interdisciplinary rehab of a person with persistent post-concussive symptoms. Tristan is from One Rehabilitation Service, South Australia.
Thank you. Before I get started, I'd just like to have a couple of acknowledgements. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we're learning and yarning on today is the Kaurna people's land, and it's a privilege to be here. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues Tess and Jasmine, who worked quite extensively on this case study with me and helped with the reflective process. So we're going to talk about Emily. Emily's not her real name, but the client that we're talking about was a part of developing this case study and the reflective process. So I'll quickly try and go through the case itself to help to establish the case and what happened. Emily is a 25-year-old female. She worked full-time as a painter's apprentice. She was a state league soccer player, and at the time of her injury, she was fit for her work and her sport. She had a past medical history of ADHD, which was diagnosed back in 2006, as well as chronic headaches after an artery Chiari malformation, which she had a procedure on, and that was in 2017. So she was injured in her workplace in April 2023, and so she was covered under Return to Work SA as an injured worker. She hit her head underneath a house. She was dragging some equipment, and she hit her head on the beam on the back of her head. At the time, she was dazed, but she remembers the incident fully, except that she's not sure about whether there was any loss of consciousness or not. Her immediate symptoms were headache and mild dizziness, and she was sent home from the worksite to rest. She returned to work the next day and commenced light duties because of her ongoing symptoms, and that was the rest of her week. And then on the weekend, she warmed up for her soccer game, and that's when her symptoms dramatically increased. So that's when she attended the GP, which was a week after her initial injury. Then a CT and MRI were both clear, so she was subsequently diagnosed with persistent concussion symptoms. So she was referred to One Rehabilitation Service in December 2023, so that was 8 months after her injury. At the time of the referral, she was not working. She'd trialled a graded return to work in July, but that was unsuccessful. So her initial goals were to be able to independently change her bed linen. That was the best short-term goal that she could come up with. And then the rest of her goals were very long-term. She wanted to be back working full-time and back playing soccer. So she was seen for our concussion service, which was an interdisciplinary assessment by physio. The findings of that assessment were that she had persistent concussion symptoms. She had a very high symptom burden. There was a diverse range of signs. She had the full gamut of phenotypes of concussion, as well as persistent pain in her neck and shoulder. So she had had some treatment prior to coming to see us, but there wasn't really any progress made for her. She felt very lost and very unsupported in her recovery at the time. So her initial team was her GP, her claims manager and her employer, and they were doing their best, but that wasn't enough for what Emily needed. So she commenced rehab, some neurophysio and orthoptics initially to really try and get her symptoms to start improving through some objective rehab and exercises. In February 2024, occupational therapy was commenced to help start working on more specific fatigue, sleep and symptom management strategies and to commence graded return to work. She was referred to psychology in March for assessment by a psychologist and skill building. And then later on in the rehab process, where deconditioning and her actual global physical condition was becoming a barrier to recovery, she was referred to exercise physiology as well. So you can see from this table of her outcome measures that initially in the early part of her rehab process, her outcome measures didn't actually really change. So there was, from December through to March, she was roughly the same, but after some momentum had been achieved and she started to make progress, then she did make good progress in that outcome measure. And eventually, those outcome measures did all return to zero and back to normal. So treatment consisted of multiple disciplines being involved that we've just talked about. It was tailored and targeted specifically to her, depending on what the objective assessments showed. There was lots of interdisciplinary collaboration and teamwork with Emily, which was really good. And between, with the team collaboration and communication, we were able to make good progress for her. The collaboration between the team was effective, timely, but most importantly, it was consistent, and it took on various forms. So we had case conferences, we had written reports and documentation, as well as shorter emails, phone calls across the team as needed. So the treatment outcomes for Emily were really positive after the momentum was gained and she continued through. So she was able to get back to her ADLs, was able to independently change her bed linen, which was her first goal. She did commence a graded return to work. She was able to start reading for pleasure again, and she was able to return to soccer training and start redeveloping those skills. In the longer term, she returned to full-time work as an apprentice painter and was able to continue her apprenticeship. She returned back to playing soccer and independent back in the gym as well. She reduced her symptom load back to her pre-injury levels of that chronic headache. She was able to read a whole book, and she returned to unlimited driving as well. So that's the synopsis of Emily's case. I guess, in summary, Emily didn't present with a simple concussion. She had quite a complex presentation by the time that she came to see me for her interdisciplinary assessment. There was lots of confounding factors because she was in a compensable scheme. She also had a lot of the documented modifying factors that we know about, including neurodiversity, being female, as well as the previous chronic headaches. So there was a lot of reason that she had persistent symptoms, and helping her to understand that and explain that initially, and help her to feel like this was something that she wasn't alone with, was really groundbreaking for her. So the treatment that we used was focused on the evidence base that we've heard about at this conference so far, that was talked about on Tuesday in the concussion workshop. We used lots of team collaboration to try and address barriers, and then consistent communication between the interdisciplinary team, including her employer and claims manager, was really, really important. So shortly after accessing the supports, Emily just demonstrated rapid recovery. Once her momentum of the rehab program was going, her recovery became quite rapid. She achieved the goals within the Interd team, and her outcomes returned to baseline measure, as we said. So due to the success of her team intervention and the integrated approach of recovery, not all the funded sessions, so not all the recommended sessions were actually required, and she was discharged from psychology and orthoptics, EP and physio in June 2024, and then was discharged from OT in July 2024. So we had about just over 7 months from referral to complete discharge. So reflections on the case. I guess I wanted to focus more on the enabling factors, the facilitators of the case and the successes we had. So the referral to the interdisciplinary team of clinicians, getting everyone involved that was indicated through the objective assessments, so the people with the right experience and that were following best practice guidelines. There was multiple discipline referrals due to the relevant symptoms and her particular goals. We all followed evidence-based treatment, and importantly with that evidence-based treatment is that it was very client-driven. We took the time to listen to Emily in terms of her concerns. The initial assessment actually took a bit longer than the average initial assessment because Emily had a lot of things that she wanted to get off of her chest, a lot of concerns that she had with her first 8 months since injury. And so we took the time to listen to those, to provide her with education and reassurance and validate. And that was, education and reassurance was then reinforced across the interdisciplinary team as her recovery went on. Really pleasingly, we had good support from the funder. So the claims manager was involved in a positive way in the interdisciplinary team. He has listened to the interdisciplinary team, followed the recommendations and was able to fund them in a really timely manner so that we could get going with rehab really quickly. There was limited buy-in from Emily initially, but once she felt safe, once she felt supported by our team, she then was a really active participant in her rehab. She then got into her home exercise programs with gusto, implemented strategies into her own lifestyle that she wouldn't ordinarily have even thought about as a good idea, and some of those she's continued on with after discharge as well. So the active participation of Emily was really important. And then as I've mentioned already, effective, timely and ongoing communication was maintained throughout treatment. So we had lots of touch points between all of the people involved in the interdisciplinary team in varying formats as needed. So the client, all of the treating Allied Health and her GP and her employer and her funder all communicating together. And that was via the case conference reports and regular correspondence in writing and on the phone. So these are some nice quotes from Emily when we asked her about presenting her case study and some reflections from her. So the feeling of being supported in the roller coasters of triumphs and hiccups of recovery took all of the stress of recovery away. I think that's something that's sort of consistent with other things that we've heard in the last couple of days as well. She also said, my recovery from concussion was slow throughout the majority of the first 12 months until I started seeing the team at One Rehab. I think I was able to have such a quick turnaround as they took their time with me and they believed in me. So again, that feeling of being supported and that feeling of not being alone was something that was really helpful to get some momentum in Emily's recovery. And my team worked together to make sure that I was heard and that I was safe at every step, and they were also excellent at working together to keep my GP and boss informed. So that's Emily's feedback as well, which fits really nicely with how we experienced Emily's rehab process as a treating team as well. And that's Emily's story and our reflections on it. So thank you.
Thanks, Tristan. I love that once Emily felt she was validated and supported, she found her gusto. Any questions for Tristan? Yes, down here. Oh, Blake, the lady with the green top here.
I was struck by the fact that Emily had an insurer who was involved, and I'm wondering how her situation differs from Les's situations involving litigation. In other words, there must not have been any litigation required to get the insurer to pay, and you must not have had to prove all the things that were wrong with Emily in order to get payment to proceed. I'm wondering if the absence of finding someone to blame is what the difference is between litigation and the insurance situation that you were dealing with.
Sure. I think some other reflections to answer your sort of question and comment there. She was an injured worker under the South Australian Return to Work SA scheme, so she had an accepted claim for persistent concussion symptoms. So when she was referred to us, there wasn't anything that we needed to prove. That the focus of that referral was about helping Emily to recover and return to full-time work, and that was really the thing that was at the forefront of the claims manager's mind. He was sort of essentially came to us and said, what do we need to do to get Emily back to full-time work? We've tried these other ways and nothing's worked so far. What can you guys do? What can you offer differently that can help Emily get back? And I think Emily, at the time when she was referred to us, there actually was a lot of her searching for blame. That was part of one of the main drivers of a lot of her symptom burden, is that she was quite overwhelmed with blame and anger about her situation. But actually providing her with some objective evidence as to why she was feeling the way she was feeling, and providing her with some hope and a sort of a pathway forward was what helped to flip that a bit and reduce the burden of those sort of more negative emotions, I guess.
Thank you. I can't see, oh yes, someone's hand's gone flying up. This will be the last question so that we can get the afternoon tea in.
Hi Tristan, I'm a physio and I work with vehicle accident work cover and private patients. My dilemma is obviously in the return to work situation. If you've got a case manager who's very supportive, as yours obviously was, that's fantastic. It's the less stressful for the client because they don't have to worry about where their income's coming from. But in the vehicle accident situation, yes, you're getting the funding for the treatment, but it's going to be a long time before people get their income replaced. And in the private situation, well, how does someone in the private situation afford this sort of multidisciplinary care? Because if they've got private health insurance, it'll probably will run out after about 3 weeks. So have you any ideas on how we can push for some sort of a publicly funded concussion treatment scheme?
I have lots of ideas. I'm just not sure where the money's going to come from. I think I essentially agree with your point. This case study is just is anecdotal evidence to support the idea that we need a completely accessible interdisciplinary concussion clinic in every state, in every district. I think the stuff that Mark talked about earlier around the clinic that they've been able to set up with the philanthropy from the hockey players is, it's excellent. There's clinics in Victoria that are government funded and are showing really, really good success as well. So I think it's just about us getting together as a team of professionals and brain injury survivors, and just trying to advocate for what we know is working to try and get those clinics funded.
Thanks so much, Tristan. Everybody, big clap for Tristan. Last speaker, people please be prepared to hang around till about 4:05 because we did start late. You'll still get lots of tea, I promise. Our last speaker today is Sarah Price. She's going to speak on a 7-week interdisciplinary group intervention program, which sounds very efficient. Let's hear about it, for clients with persistent post-concussive symptoms. Sarah's from Barwon Health in Victoria. Sarah.
Hi everyone. So I am a neuropsychologist. I work in adult outpatient rehab. What I'm going to present today is, I guess, an intervention that we developed all on part-time EFT among all the clinicians. There's no funding, there's no fancy RCT. This is what we do in the trenches, if you like. So I'm really excited to hear what you think about the group and if you have any questions. So before I continue, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Okay, so we've heard a lot about persisting symptoms after a concussion and about the recovery timeframes. I guess I wanted to talk about our experience. So in our team, we've noticed a significant increase in concussion referrals over the past few years. These clients, we feel, have often had longer episodes of care than the more severe traumatic brain injured clients. And at times, we've really struggled to provide efficient care within our model of time-limited and goal-focused rehab. At times, our treatment was fragmented, it was really highly symptom-focused, and it required clients to attend multiple appointments, which can really increase stress. Clinicians were feeling underskilled in the area, and both clinicians and clients were reportedly feeling really stuck. So, the easy solution was to develop or increase our competence in treating persistent symptoms after a concussion by really focusing and developing and implementing a holistic treatment. And we wanted to address those interplay between the physical, the emotional, and the cognitive aspects of concussion. So, an easy task. So, I know we've talked a bit, or Mark did, about why some people take longer to recover from concussion. So this 4P model really helps us to kind of understand what's happening for clients. There's predisposing factors that make people more likely to experience longer symptoms. There's precipitating factors, so related to the injury themselves. And then there's perpetuating factors. And those factors are things that are going to maintain those symptoms. So for us, we thought that addressing these perpetuating factors was going to give us the best opportunity to improve clients' functioning. So what are they? So obviously exacerbation of a mental health condition. Obviously any mental health condition that develops after a concussion. Misdiagnosis of symptoms. We often saw clients coming in with significant physical injuries and their concussion was totally missed. It's not until they come to us months later thinking they're going crazy because they've got all these symptoms that they don't know what's happening. Also, they've missed symptoms like BPPV, which can really then impact day-to-day functioning. Poor sleep. Also, ideas about their concussion. So thinking, no, I have to be better in 6 weeks, or there's something wrong with me, or my brain is permanently damaged and I'm never going to get better. This also led into some unhelpful illness behaviours. So we saw clients sometimes doing too much activity or not enough, or some were just totally avoiding symptoms altogether. We also had some clients who presented with unrelenting standards or perfectionism. So many in the research field have this issue, unrelenting standards. It's a good thing, but it really can then make it difficult to return to life when we have those kind of standards. Also, some avoidant coping styles can really then play a big factor in those persistent symptoms. So clearly from this model here, we really needed to take a holistic approach. Okay, so what are the principles underlying or the foundations of our intervention? So really the main goal was to create a space where clients felt comfortable to step out of their comfort zone, to try new ways of being and to living. being open to increase that zone and to stretch that zone out. So compassion, it may sound really obvious. However, I often had other disciplines come to me and they'd say, I've told her how to pace, she's just not doing it. Or, I think there's some inconsistency in her behaviour. So I guess our clinicians were feeling really burnt out, they were feeling really stuck, and they just felt like they didn't have the competence to manage it. So really growing these skills was really important in bringing back in that compassion, to have that positive regard for clients and a sense that there is really hope for growth and potential. Patience and practice, change takes time. I don't know, has anyone tried to change anything? It's exhausting and, you're always up and down and up and down. It really does take a lot of practice. And our clients have to try out strategies and fail before they can course correct. It's really about building insight. A good sense of humour helps with everything. A shared formulation was really crucial. I didn't want to leave anyone in the dark. I wanted to say, this is what I think's happening. What do you think's happening? What do you think is going to be most helpful to work on? Because if you have everyone's buy-in, then they're going to be more engaged and they're really going to, engage a lot more. And the other thing clients reported is that they found a new lens, a new way to understand what was happening to them and a new language in which to describe their symptoms and describe themselves and what they needed from other people. I think we often underestimate the power of language and words. The third point was working with values and goal settings. A lot of clients said, I've really just lost my way, I've lost my identity. So really getting back to what is most valuable to them, what drives them, what makes them get up in the morning, really kind of cut out all that clutter around everything else. They could really focus on what they really wanted to work on. And that's really resulted in more effective, more meaningful behaviour change. It also really increases our emotional resilience and our psychological flexibility, because one of my values is helping people, and in line with that is really sharing what we've developed here so we can help other people. There's no way, otherwise I would have stood up here and suffered a sleepless night and a lot of anxiety otherwise. So values are key. So what is our intervention ingredients? So obviously acute, accurate and timely information, but it's more than psycho-ed. I don't want to just educate people. It kind of sounds, it just sounds a bit wrong to me. Also wanted to shift the perspective away from the injury and the symptoms to really promote that holistic approach to wellbeing, to functional recovery, getting back to what's important. Getting moving again. We know cardiovascular exercise is really important and it's medicine. The problem is, couch potatoes like myself, I was having to reframe that into getting moving rather than exercise, because some of these people never saw the inside of a gym. So, we had to be realistic about our expectations. Talking about being open to experiencing those mild symptoms, because that's the only way that they were going to improve. And also talking about the nervous system and how it's really fantastic because it looks after us and it protects us. However, after a traumatic event, we know that the nervous system can be kind of wired to turn on when it's not needed or turning on too much. So we talked a lot about activating that soothing response and really deactivating that fight and flight system. We looked at noticing, naming and unhooking from unhelpful thoughts and feelings. We know research tells us if we can name what we're feeling or thinking, we're miles ahead in feeling better. Just that simple act of noticing and naming. Because we want to be on the floor playing Lego with the kids, or we want to be able to go to the kids' basketball match. Also talked about practicing self-compassion. Change is hard. It takes time to master. You're going to fail. It's going to be tricky. So really trying to encourage people to take a non-judgmental view of themselves and the way they're living. And being present. Avoidant and boom-bust behaviour, we know that really flares up symptoms. So really figuring out how we can change that over time. Seeking support. It's hard to be the one who's cared for, to accept help for a lot of my clients because they're always the helper. So it's taking a bit of reframing, reaching out, being open to be helped as well. Assertive communication. These people know before managing life, they didn't need to be as assertive, but now, they aren't able to do what they were. So being able to practice being assertive and sitting with that uncomfortable feeling of other people's reactions and responses. I know one client said to me, I can't come to the group because I've got to work, and we had a bit of a chat, and then she said, this is for me, Sarah. I'm going to come, I feel really sick about it, but I'm going to do it. And by the end, she was a total advocate for assertiveness for everybody in the room. And of course, poor sleep and cognition. So I won't harp on about the magic of groups. I love groups. I don't know if you've ever been in a group or run a group, but they're an intervention in themselves. They're just amazing. You get a lot of support, belonging, encouragement, motivation, and it's cost effective. I'm not saying the same thing to every client, 5 times in one day. And it's interdisciplinary. Obviously, varied symptoms need varied expertise. But I think the one really big thing for us was with that increase in competence, we really felt less stuck. We have a plan, we know what works with these clients, and we stick to it. All of us, the whole team. So the group, the format was a 6-week program, 2 hours per week with morning tea and a 7th booster session 4 weeks later to really check in and see how they're going with their goals. So in that group, we practiced and modelled pacing, and we taught and practiced our strategies, our breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, compassion breaks, identifying those protective factors that support us. We took mindful walks, we used fidgets. We did a lot of that in the group, so teaching. The clients in this pilot group were 15 clients over a year and a bit in 4 groups, and they were quite varied in age, from 30 to 74, with, as we know, the majority were females. The time since injury really varied from 1 month to 4 years, and we had a lot of experts in the room. It was largely led by psychology, but we relied heavily on physiotherapists, exercise phys, OT, social work and clin-psych. So what did we find? It was feasible. We had a full retention of clients. People told me, Sarah, 2 hours is too much. They're not going to cope. But they were saying, can we come back again? I'm like, no, it's the end of the group. You have to leave. 100% said they would recommend that program to other people, and they felt they could use those strategies. They asked for a group session for partners, family and friends, so we've now incorporated that. So what did we find on our measures? We found changes in the way people felt about their symptoms. There was less pessimism, less concerned, and they were feeling more in control of their symptoms. And that were really reflected in behaviour. So they were getting back to activities, increase in activity levels, and really importantly, less avoidance of that exercise. And those activities, they were finding they could do them with less difficulty. So that was amazing. Surprisingly, because we did not expect this, we also found fewer and less severe symptoms, concussion symptoms. They didn't go away, but there were fewer and less of them. So I think I've run out of time, but this is what some clients said. The content was very helpful, talking it through with others and listening to how others were working through their symptoms. The group felt welcoming, open and a safe environment to share thoughts and feelings, gave me new ideas and strategies. And I would also like to finish by acknowledging my fabulous, well, not mine, but the fabulous team who helped to develop this amazing work. So thank you.